Hi, I'm S.J. Grant.
I'm Margaret Grossman.
I'm Carson Hagler.
I'm Marshall Westbrook.
And today we are talking about applying theories of human skill learning to acquisition in pigeons. So to start off, what is skill learning? Skill learning is a behavioral pattern that leads to autonomy in the individual completing the task. There must be flexibility in order for learning to occur. Environmental cues guide the individual during the task, and practicing the task over time can lead to the individual doing it on their own and without the help of an instructor. Not only is it important for us to understand models of human skill learning, it's also important when working with animals. For example, animal trainers work many hours with a variety of species. They might know the procedures and methods for working with and training with an animal, but they might not know the mechanisms behind the learning. Human models of skill learning help us understand cognitive capabilities in animals, and there are not many models that apply to animals. The goal of this semester was to continue Dr. Reed's spring 2019 senior thesis of applying models of human skill learning to learning in pigeons.
Dr. Reed's research group last year wanted to apply Logan's instance theory of automation to animal behavior in order to determine if human models could account for pigeon data. They did this by conducting an experiment in which they put the pigeons into two separate experimental groups, a position group and a color group. Within the position group, the pigeons were tasked with completing a 3-peg sequence based on ordinal position. Within this condition, they pegged the 3 white keys within a particular order. For the color group, the pigeons were tasked with completing a 3-peg key color sequence. In this condition, pigeons had to peg the correct color sequence which appeared randomly on the keys for each trial. It was predicted that the color task would be more difficult for the pigeons to complete than the position task due to the fact that the position of the colored keys changed from trial to trial. Reaction times for these sequences were measured in order to determine if speed up of trial occurred. Our senior thesis group this year took this data and conducted linear regressions to obtain R-squared values so that we could compare this data to the predictions of Logan's model. We found that Logan's model only accounted for 40% of our data, making it a poor fit for pigeon behavior.
As Carson just said, Logan's model only accounted for 40% of the 2019 spring thesis data. Logan's model works off the assumption that episodic memory can explain behavior. For each instance of memory, it explains a gradual speed up in performance of a behavior. Logan's model utilizes the power law of practice. The power law of practice, simplified, is practice makes perfect. As you can see, this is Logan's experiment with humans, with the y-axis being reaction time and the x-axis being number of presentations. As number of presentations increased, reaction time sped up or decreased. Therefore, Logan's model being applied to this human data accounted for 99% of all the data. When applied to the 2019 spring thesis data, 40%, Logan's model only accounted for 40%. So this led to the exploration of other models to explain the behavior.
One of the human skill learning models we looked at was a mesh control model presented by Christensen, Sutton, and McGillen. This model incorporates both cognitive and motor processes to explain the learning process, but it also heavily relies on verbal communication. So for example, when you go to the doctor and they ask you what's wrong or where you're hurting, you have to verbalize where your pain is. With the mesh control model, humans are required to verbalize the degree of difficulty and the decision making during a task. So with the pigeons, because we cannot speak to them, we cannot understand the level of difficulty or the decision making they face during the pegging task. Therefore, this model is phenomenological and is not applicable to the pigeon behavior as well as other animals.
The second model we looked at was one proposed by Stella and Olson, which focused on learning from performance errors and an individual's ability to assign blame to a wrong action so that they can detect errors and further facilitate learning. This model, however, does not acknowledge reinforcement mechanisms that provide feedback for correct actions. While we do believe that pigeons are sensitive to making errors in the same way that humans are, previous research has suggested that a pigeon's ability to assign credit to a correct action is a stronger facilitator of learning than their ability to assign blame. Although we believe that this model could potentially be applied to pigeons, we came to the conclusion that models of skill learning that emphasize reinforcement are better suited for pigeon data than models of skill learning that emphasize learning from performance errors.
The third model that we looked at was a computational reinforcement learning model by Fu and Anderson. Throughout history, we are able to easily identify thousands of studies that are conducted using tangible reinforcements. For example, if you give a dog a treat for sitting, the treat is the reinforcer that will increase the likelihood of the dog to continue to sit. It's within the last 30 to 35 years that researchers have tried to incorporate reinforcement in computers. This type of reinforcement learning in computers is used for theoretical neuroscience studies that work to achieve artificial intelligence. As a matter of fact, our professor, Dr. Reed, has worked with these types of models by creating computer-simulated rats to determine space and navigation to find the food. In the Fu and Anderson study, they use a computer to provide a feedback of reinforcement of 1 or no reinforcement of 0. Backwards propagation of credit is the assignment of credit. So when the pigeons were completing the 3 peck sequences, it was only the 3rd peck where the pigeons received food. The pigeons assigned credit to the peck with the temporal difference. And as you can see on the graph, the P step 4, which is the propagation step 4, is going to be like the last peck for the pigeons, and it's the highest because it's the most associated to the reward, and the reinforcement signal propagates back in time and diminishes as it goes farther away from the actual reward, which is going to be P step 1, which is also related to the first peck that the pigeons made. Therefore, we decided that this one would be applicable to the pigeon data.
The control of automated behavior describes a dual processor model and discrete sequence production task. The top figure describes the discrete sequence production task. Each participant was given 2 distinct different sequences from all other participants. The sequences were at least 3 key presses long for each sequence. So basically the sequence was associated with key presses on a keyboard and then placeholder icons on a computer that lit up for each key. For example, the 3rd placeholder icon that may light up may be associated with the D key on the keyboard, while the 4th icon that lit up would be associated with the 4th key on the keyboard, which would be F. The dual processor model, which is here in this bottom figure, with the y-axis being response time and x-axis being the sequence, with T1 being the first key in a sequence. So 3 different parts of this chart are labeled. These are the processing phases. So the first processing phase is the initiation phase. So the initiation phase is associated with the first key press. The first key press is associated with the longest response time of any of the key presses. And as sequence length increases, so does that first key press up to a point. The next processing phase is the execution phase. This is associated with effortless key presses after the initiation phase. And then the third and last processing phase is concatenation. This is associated with a key press with a response time that is greater than the execution phase, but also less than the initiation processing phase. This is the loading of the next part or chunk of the sequence. Later on in the model, the dual processor model, it describes the race between the motor and cognitive processors. I don't have time in the presentation to discuss all of the processor model. However, in the question section of the presentation, I'd be glad to answer any questions regarding it.
So throughout the semester, our goals have changed. At the beginning of the semester, our goal was to choose articles to fit the data, but we realized that we couldn't actually, well, we had 2 that were applicable and 2 that were not. While our goal was to give a formal comparison of the pigeon data with the Akaki information criterion, we also found that we could not do that. So while 2 of the models did not seem to work, while 2 varied greatly in the number of parameters, it was this Because of this, the Cocky information criteria was not useful in comparing the models. The Abrahamsey model, for example, could not concretely determine the amount of parameters needed. A way to fix this problem would be to use the two options for creating applicable models of skill learning, top-down and bottom-up approaches. The top-down approach uses a complex model and modifies it to fit the data with the parameters, whereas the bottom-up approach starts with the simple foundations of the model and it builds on parameters with the model. The bottom-up approaches are used for creating skill learning models that are applicable across the species. So the next step for future studies could be to apply the Fu and Anderson model to the procedures for the pigeons. We would like to give a special thanks to Dr. Reed for all of his help through the semester, to Pat Nolan for listening in on our lectures, and to the Wofford Psychology Department.